Recoded is the black sheep of the Kingdom Hearts series. It's a weird little game. Some people say it's the best of the mobile games in this series. Some say it's the best game in the whole series, and some say it's easily the worst. No other game in the series is so split like this one. It also tends to be overlooked in discussion of the series, probably because most people consider it to be barely canon, and even if it is, it's not important to understand the plot. Let's take some time and explore why this one is so divisive. But first, some groundwork and explanation. Those that know the series really well might be a little confused as to why I'm doing this one next, when Recoded actually came out after 358 Days and Birth by Sleep. Well, you'll probably also know that the game that Recoded is a remake of, Coded, came out before all of these in 2008. It was released on mobile phones, and not iPhones, mind you. The App Store was only just starting to get popular in the games division a few months before this game came out. No, this was the kind of thing this game released on, and this is what it looked like at the time. I would call this a questionable decision, but doing so would likely be an understatement. This is probably a big reason why the game didn't have a story that tied directly into future games, as the game wasn't even released out of Japan until October of 2010, with the remake titled Recoded, developed by Hand, the same people that made Days, and a number of other games for Square. The original Coded was more of a puzzle game than a traditional Kingdom Hearts game, largely because the controls were a bit difficult to make work for that system. According to interviews, Nomura wanted the game to be like an amusement park, in the sense that there would be a lot of attractions throughout the game. This ended up manifesting as a number of different gameplay styles, something we'll discuss in a bit. Recoded, on the other hand, has a more traditional KH combat style, thanks to the more robust controls of the DS. Recoded came out after 358 Days and Birth by Sleep, and so Nomura stated that Recoded ended up being a combination of the three: the story of Coded, the leveling system of Days, and the combat of Birth by Sleep. So discussing this game first will give us a unique perspective on the ones that came in between the original release and the re-release of this one. This should technically be the improved version of those games, so we can start by looking at what works in this one and what doesn't, then determine whether they learned lessons from shortcomings in the original games like Nomura claims they did in interviews. The story of this one also came first after KH2, so it makes more sense from a narrative standpoint, though the stories of these games can really be experienced in just about any order because they have very little relation. As for this game, there are some incidental quirks due to the fact that it's basically a remastered mobile phone game. There are numerous different gameplay styles peppered throughout. This made more sense in the original version, but is kind of odd because the combat is actually robust enough to carry the game now. It's not bad or anything, just a little odd. This is a weird little game, like I said. The original also had a focus on puzzles rather than combat, whereas this one takes more of a traditional KH approach, though you can still see elements of that poking through in certain areas. Its marked differences include an in-depth progression system, improved combat, and more platforming. Though that last one isn't a positive, just by the way. Nomura stated in interviews that, in response to some complaints from Days and Birth by Sleep, he wanted to avoid technical fights as much as possible. He also made the progression system a bit more free-form and malleable, encouraging planning more than in most of the games. And, in my opinion, this game does a good job of achieving those goals, but hey, let's support that claim. I thought it would be interesting, since this game is so full of differing gameplay styles, to figure out how much time I spent in each of them and structure the gameplay analysis in descending order of commonality. I took all of my game footage and chopped it up into pieces in Premiere in order to analyze the length of each gameplay style. The top, at 3 hours, 19 minutes, and 16 seconds, should be no surprise to anyone. It's combat. Followed closely by exploration at 2 hours and 15 minutes, menuing at 1 hour and 22 minutes, something I deemed exploration puzzles at 1 hour and 13 minutes, platforming at an unfortunate 38 minutes, turn-based combat at 37 minutes, and finally on-rail shooting at 24 minutes. For a grand total of 9 hours, 51 minutes, 37 seconds, and 21 frames or so. Yeah, this game has turn-based combat and on-rail shooting. We're in for a treat this time. The combat in this game is largely the same as the previous games, but with a big change, borrowed from Birth by Sleep. But let's start with the basic combos. You should know what to expect by now, and this is no different. A cool difference is that certain Keyblades have unique combos that change the attack's strength and speed. The Olympia and Metal Chocobo have heavier, slower attacks that deal much more damage and stagger enemies more often. The Three Wishes and Lionheart have much faster combos that deal less damage and seem to stagger enemies less. Generally, this combat system feels a little weightless to me, probably just a side effect of it being on the DS, but it doesn't always feel great to play. The biggest change to the combat system is that the command menu is now gone, replaced instead by the command deck. Abilities, called commands, come in the form of pre-baked animations that play out, dealing damage and causing certain elemental effects depending on the command. Some of these are quick and snappy, some lock you in place for the duration of the attack, some can't be used in the air, others allow you to continue attacking during their duration. The X button uses the currently selected command, and the left shoulder button can be used in tandem with the D-pad to scroll through the commands. You can also set a certain command as a favorite and get to it by using the left shoulder button and the right D-pad, or maybe left, I'm not sure. Only a certain number of commands can be equipped at a time, and more can be unlocked as the game progresses. This aids to balance, to some degree, the issues that the command system menu had, wherein certain abilities got overpowered and were easily spammable. On the other hand, the abilities themselves have become more powerful overall, and have less opportunity cost as they take up no resource like MP anymore. For example, Thundara in KH1 is an ability you get maybe 2/3 of the way through the game, but in this one I had it in the second world. Instead of consuming MP, commands enter a recharge period when used. Typically, stronger abilities take longer to recharge than weaker ones. The amount of time is never incredibly long by any means, and the shorter times can be quite fast. You could decide that spamming weaker abilities may be better than stronger ones that have long wait times, especially in the case of something like Cure, where higher levels of that spell can often be overkill. I do feel that items got the shaft this time around. They take up the same amount of space as a command in the deck, don't recharge when used, and don't earn command points to level up, but you can only have a certain number equipped until they're completely gone. You can always equip more, but they don't restore in between battles, so it just seems superfluous when Cure is so easy to acquire. Items could have retained their current mechanics but been an extra thing on top of the command deck, maybe a single battle item slot in which any battle item could be equipped. Cure could have been nerfed slightly to make this work, and battle items would have had more purpose. Commands have a number of different spells. On top of regular spells, there are dives, blasts, edges, sweeps, dashes, crashes, raids, and a few others. Each of these can typically be augmented with fire, ice, lightning, or air damage, and they will even have a chance to deal their relevant status effect of burning damage, freezing, shocking, or knocking the enemy in the air and spinning them around. The number of commands is surprisingly large. Most of them chain well with melee combos. The seamlessness of this creates a sort of freeform combo system. People have compared this to DMC, though I don't really see it. Once you've used up your quote-unquote combo, as in used your melee attacks and commands in succession, you're left with nothing to do but melee combos while you wait for the commands to recharge. DMC, on the other hand, is about stringing together the longest and most varied combos possible, with few limitations beyond your skill and the abilities you have unlocked. Also, these combos only work on fodder enemies, as most bosses will break out of a combo well before you're done. Commands can be leveled and have a max level. Command points are earned by defeating enemies using these commands. At max level, commands can be combined in the command matrix to make new, more powerful commands. This combat system is actually fairly impressive, as it should be since it's a retooling of the system already present in Birth by Sleep. Commands are mostly snappy and chain into melee combos well, but they don't make you invincible for their duration, meaning using them requires smart play and that you're not just spamming them during enemy attacks. Some bosses discourage the use of commands because they are easier to whiff with due to the way they function, as in Sora doesn't move toward his target in most cases. On the other hand, some bosses discourage use of melee attacks because they tend to be higher commitment than commands. It's a solid balance and rewards the player for getting good with both melee combos and commands, as well as both at the same time. On top of commands and melee combos, each Keyblade has a unique fighting style to it, implied by the clock system. Each Keyblade has a set of abilities, which are unlocked by striking enemies. These abilities can do things like give you a higher defense, make your attacks faster, auto-dodge, give your blocks a health drain function, give your attacks elemental damage, make the Keyblade hit enemies from farther away, and a number of other cool things. Abilities are arranged in a tree-like structure, and you select which abilities down the line you want to activate at each stage as you use the Keyblade during battle. Once you get to the end of the clock tree, you'll enter overclock mode, which gives you access to the finisher moves. These are flashy, powerful, and have infinite iframes for the duration. Some just play out instantly, similar to a command. Some require you to perform a quick-time event to get the most out of them. Performing the finisher move sets your clock back to level 1, and the clock abilities must be earned again by attacking. The finisher move takes up the A button, also known as the melee attack button, so you can't use regular combos until you've used a finisher. I like this system a lot. It gives each Keyblade a unique feel and valid tactics in many situations. Let's talk about some bosses. Firstly, a dishonorable mention goes to, you guessed it, Genie Jafar in Agrabah. His arena is square this time, with Jafar occupying the middle of the square. You have to chase down Iago to damage the lamp like usual, except this time Jafar's attacks actually have a chance to kill you. His fireball throw attack is quite a bit more difficult to dodge, especially since locking onto Iago will pull the camera away from Jafar, so you can't actually see him do it. Thankfully, he does make a noise consistently at the start of the attack. Phase 2 is the real problem though, as the boss suddenly becomes very platform intensive. We've yet to talk about why the platforming is bad, don't worry, we'll get there, but for now just know that it's stiff, clunky, and unintuitive. On top of having to follow Iago up onto these platforms in order to attack the lamp, Jafar will also use this attack where he calls meteors down from the ceiling. This is distinctly a problem because you can't see high enough to reliably dodge them in time. Now mind you, there is a second camera mode that pulls the camera out a bit further, more similar to its look in KH2, but be mindful that this mode actually points the camera more toward the ground while flying further out, making it even more difficult to see the meteors in time. The meteors also have shadows which slowly grow in the ground, which isn't helpful when you're in the air or on the platforms in the arena, which you will be often because you need to attack Iago. Jafar uses this attack constantly, so it's not like you can just wait it out by running around or whatever. Good grief. On the hardest difficulty, I died to these things in one hit, and let's just say that it was immensely frustrating. The best way to show some of the more detailed differences in the system compared to the past games is to look at some key bosses. Pete shows up to fight us a couple of times, and his fight is very similar to his KH2 counterpart. He doesn't stagger nearly as easily as in KH2, however, which means command spam is somewhat encouraged. His attacks are a bit slower, but he doesn't like to stagger in between attacks. Usually the only consistent stagger point is right after his combo move. He's got a few other attacks that are more like modifications of some of his KH2 moves that he uses periodically, but he's not too bad for the most part. Immediately after Pete, we fight Riku. Again, he's very similar to his KH1 counterpart, or more accurately, the version of his fight from Rechain of Memories. His attacks home in on Sora, making them much harder to dodge. Otherwise, he's fairly simple and staggers readily in between attacks. Immediately after Riku, we fight Riku again. He adds a modifier to his dive attack that sends blocks out around him. This fight during my playthrough showed a significant difference from this fight and the original fight in KH1. Using commands during enemy attacks rarely results in a parry. If you'll remember, a big part of my strategy for Riku in KH1 was to parry or block his attacks and retaliate, but this game makes parries much more difficult to accomplish and almost impossible with most commands. It made me realize a big part of why I think KH1 and 2 were able to have such speed without sacrificing fairness in their better boss designs. In something like Dark Souls, attacking at the same time as your opponent will result in a few possible things, but unless you're a giant dad or something, those things will rarely be beneficial and will at best result in you and the boss taking damage at the same time. In KH1 and 2, attacking a boss at the same time that they attack you regularly results in a parry or some other potentially neutral outcome. This allows the bosses to attack with smaller lead-ins to their strikes, as pressing the attack button at the same time that the boss starts a windup won't often result in the player entering a disadvantageous position. Rather, they and the boss will usually just cancel each other out if their attacks connect. Bosses that don't adhere to this rule are usually larger or use less tangible attacks like spells. Parries are still in this game, but they seem to be more difficult to pull off, and the boss rarely, if ever, staggers when this happens in my experience. Immediately after Riku again, we fight Riku again. Finally, he adds Dark Aura, and it is a doozy. It reminds me a lot of the Lingering Will's arrow attack, except a lot faster and a bit longer. It's totally dodgeable, but takes a bit to learn the timing. My main problem here is that this string of 4 boss fights in a row doesn't restore your healing items, and in some cases, your HP from battle to battle. This wouldn't be a problem because I don't use healing items, but the section just prior to this one essentially disables your healing commands, so items are the only way to heal. It goes into this boss rush with no warning that it's coming, and the sunk cost fallacy kicks in around the 3rd fight in this rush, which is also probably about when you'll realize the healing items aren't restoring, depending on how well you do in the first 2 fights. This made this boss significantly more difficult than it needed to be, as I entered the final phase with about 2 hits worth of healing and no healing items. So yeah, I quick-loaded quite a bit. Thanks, RetroArch. There is a new fight with Darkseid that is the best version of that fight that we've seen so far. He attacks faster, has a more varied moveset, and is actually challenging. That unfortunately gives way to 3 fights against Sora's Shadow. In order to really hurt him, you have to pick up the Golden Keyblade after the Shadow does this raining attack. This will transform the Shadow into a regular Shadow, allowing you to deal a bunch of damage. This is mostly fine, but the second and third fights against this guy add 2 doppelgangers you have to deal with as well. One will have an aura, that's the real one, so you have to take out at least one of the doppelgangers before the golden key will spawn. This just feels weirdly padded, like this boss needed to be a certain length for some arbitrary reason. Lastly, Roxas fulfills the final boss role for this one. Again, his moveset is very similar to his KH2 counterpart, except he splits up the combo into a few separate moves that he cycles between. He also has a couple moves that can scramble your controls or silence your commands. Silence is a pretty lame mechanic in this game because you just end up running around dodging attacks, which isn't really difficult while spamming dodge roll typically, just frustrating. He adds lasers into the fight, and for some reason they can track you down. You also, unlike in KH2, have no means of dealing with them besides dodge rolling. This seems a thoughtless inclusion, especially once lasers are included in attacks that can layer in unfair ways because blocking no longer gives Sora iframes. Overall, he's fine, just extremely difficult and requires some pretty good reaction times on your part, as well as careful consideration of your positioning. This is ironic considering Nomura is quoted in the Recoded Ultimania as having tried to avoid technical fights as much as possible in response to days being too hard. Yeah, okay bud. Be aware that I did play this whole game on the hardest difficulty, so that may be why this was so challenging for me, but even on lower difficulties he's still complicated to retaliate against due to these issues. Overall, the combat is interesting at least. It doesn't feel great and some of the commands are a little janky when trying to combine them with others, but for the most part the game's combat is energetic and flashy while still retaining some semblance of challenge. Even fodder enemies can be challenging, as they will often appear as keys to open up the portals at the end of the system sectors, which we'll discuss later, being much faster and more difficult than most fodder enemies in the game. What largely lets the game down in terms of combat is the design of the bosses mostly. There are some solid stinkers in this one, though the number of good bosses does outweigh the bad ones, just barely though. This game is actually pretty heavy on exploration, I would say more so than KH1 even. Each world has a collection of rooms and the game rewards you for exploring with prize blocks, which can contain anything from commands to healing items to grid chips, which we'll talk about when we discuss the leveling system. All of these blocks create plenty of hiding spots for useful items, and there are even small-scale puzzles with certain types of blocks, like the one where you have to get 2 matching blocks next to each other in order to unlock the prize block they contain. Platforming does put a bit of a damper on exploration, but we'll discuss that more later as I've said. There are also a number of pretty good exploration-based puzzles throughout the game to break up the constant combat. Wonderland has a maze, as well as multiple rooms where quote-unquote stealth is needed, though don't roll your eyes at this. The stealth in this game is simple enough to be fun and short enough to not get boring. Later, when we get to Castle Oblivion, that entire world is basically an exploration-based puzzle, and a pretty good one at that, though I'm gonna dive into that in a bit. The game is also full of these things called system sectors, which are basically just a collection of pre-baked rooms with enemies in them. They also contain platforming challenges for those with the aptitude, and they reward exploration in the same way that the regular areas do. Certain enemies must be defeated for the gate to the next floor to open, and you'll know which rooms have targets in them because they'll be red instead of blue, both in the game and on the map. Defeating enemies rewards sector points, or SP, which can be spent after the system sector is over for prizes, such as really good commands and debug devices, particularly useful items in the leveling system. At the beginning of each floor, you can earn more SP by gambling some of your current total on whether or not you complete a certain challenge by the end of the floor. These come in a wide variety, such as leaving the floor in a certain amount of time, not getting hit a certain number of times, or using your finisher a certain number of times. These are also repeatable, and any rewards that aren't unique can be won as many times as you like, so there's some solid replayability as well. Exploration is actually a pretty good addition to this game, kinda surprised to say that honestly. Speaking of good additions, let's talk about the menus and the systems contained therein. Most of the time spent menuing will be in the stat matrix, which is where you level up. Each of these squares can have a grid chip installed into it. Grid chips have a number of functions. Level up chips increase your level. HP, strength, magic, defense, and luck chips all increase those skills by the number attached to them. Fire, Blizzard, Thunder, Arrow, and Cure all increase how effective those spells and any commands with those elements are. Each element also has a corresponding resistance that can be increased. This continues to be utterly useless, even though it is quickly becoming one of the most consistent inclusions in the combat system. The grid system is separated by CPUs, which, when reached by a line of chips, will double every chip in that line. Any chip can also be swapped out for any other chip at will. You can also unlock more command slots and accessory slots by completing strings of chips in between the command and accessory expanders and the corresponding CPUs. There are abilities that can be unlocked as well in the same manner. Most of these can be switched on or off at will in the stat matrix, the only exception being scan. Sometimes you'll hit a roadblock called a bug chip. They can be broken by a debug device of the corresponding color, R for red and Y for yellow. These are mostly purchasable from system sectors and are a valuable commodity as there are no extra debug devices, only just enough to clear out all the bug chips. The stat matrix also has what the game calls cheat tuners, little devices that can be used to augment certain elements of the game. The difficulty cheat changes the difficulty of the game. Interestingly, this game's difficulty is a little different in terms of what changes from the rest of the series. In this one, damage output, both with elemental and non-elemental attacks, increases as difficulty does. That's pretty standard, but what's more unique is that the higher difficulties also increase the chance of enemies inflicting status ailments, with critical mode exhibiting a staggering 100% chance of status ailments anytime an enemy uses an attack with a chance of dealing one. Enemies will also attack faster as the difficulty increases. These differences are a step beyond simple multiplication of damage numbers. The feel of the game actually changes to account for higher difficulty. If these changes also affect bosses, then that definitely explains why I've struggled so much with some of them. Difficulty also increases the quality of items dropped by enemies and world clear bonuses when beating the end boss of each world. I played the whole game on critical, so I definitely struggled, though I will say it still wasn't terrible overall. The loot cheat tampers with how often enemies drop items. Raising the drop rate decreases Sora's HP by a certain percentage. I spent almost my whole game with this at 6 times the drop rate, which meant my HP was perpetually at 70%. This definitely made bosses more of a struggle than they needed to be, and it's definitely advisable to turn it off at times because increased drop rate has exceptionally diminishing returns the further in the game you are. Case in point, I had more junk commands than I knew what to do with by the time the game was over. The prize cheat tampers with how often prizes appear. Raising the prize rate makes enemies stronger. I didn't really fool with this one as I didn't see much benefit. The CP cheat increases the amount of command points you receive, so your commands will level up faster, but you'll receive less experience, which unlocks level chips for the stat matrix. The HP cheat is unlocked right toward the end of the game and tampers with Sora's and enemies' maximum HP. Setting it to 0% reduces everyone's HP to 1. I also didn't fool with this because it seemed odd to me, but it sounds like it might be fun to screw around with a little bit. The stat matrix is a really great addition to this game. It's very freeform and customizable, allows for players to fine-tune the difficulty and have bonuses for higher difficulty. Its UI and UX are both excellent. It's a cool system. Next up is the command matrix, which is where you install commands to be used in battle. Installing 2 commands into each slot will test transform them into a new command. As you defeat enemies, you'll earn CP, which will eventually level up the commands all the way up to max. Once there, you can permanently transform the 2 slotted commands into the test command, with the possibility of lowering the resulting command's reload time, increasing how fast it builds clock gauge, or increasing the command's level to start out. This is a fun system to experiment with and highly encourages that experimentation since it's so non-committal until you want to fuse the commands together. Finally, the gear matrix is where you pick your accessories, keyblade, and clock abilities. Not much else to say to this one. Menuing in this game is excellent, with some creative design on the interfaces and rewarding systems that encourage player expression. They added variability to subsequent playthroughs and fighting styles, and they're just fun to use. I found myself a little sad when I had run out of stuff to tweak in the menus every time I dove back into them after a long period of gameplay, and that to me is a sign that I'm enjoying my time with a particular system of a game. Now there are still 3 more gameplay styles, so let's go ahead and wrap those up, starting with the most common and worst of the 3, platforming. To begin, I want to lay out the basics of movement in this game so you can understand what's going on here. Sora can only move in the 8 ordinal and cardinal directions, an issue of this game being on the DS and only having a directional pad to move in. The camera also isn't freely controllable thanks to the lack of a right stick. Instead, tapping the right shoulder button forces the camera behind Sora, or you can hold the right shoulder button and use the D-pad to move it more freely. I think it's also possible to use the touchscreen to pan the camera around, but even if this is true, it's a moot point because your hand has to come all the way off the face buttons to do this. To jump, you can press the B button like in other games, or Sora will automatically jump after hitting a ledge, a la Legend of Zelda. On top of that, you have access to 2 air steps, which can be unlocked in the stat matrix, making platforming challenges somewhat easier. Now for why I think the platforming is atrocious. Firstly, the platforming challenges in the game are way too complicated. Many of them involve these green blocks that disappear after a shockingly short amount of time, meaning that you have a tight window to wrestle the controls into a position that will allow you to actually complete the challenge. Secondly, the platforms, especially when moving, are just a bit too small to be comfortable. Sora will pull himself up onto a platform if he hits the side of it, thankfully, but even this has issues. Anytime you need to jump to the right or the left of the camera has a tendency to pivot behind Sora while he's jumping. If Sora isn't dead on facing the platform, he won't grab it. This game's controls are camera dependent, so when you press the up button, Sora moves toward the top of the camera. When you press the right button, Sora moves toward the right of the camera, and so on. This is standard for games like this, but the problem is that when the camera pans to end up behind Sora, Sora fidgets back and forth in the air as the camera's position changes the direction Sora is traveling. The most likely scenario being that this will cause Sora to not connect with the platform and pull himself up, sending you back to the beginning of the challenge. This is not an uncommon occurrence, mind you. You've been watching a few areas where it's likely to happen. This can, of course, be fixed by meticulously making sure that the camera is behind Sora before every jump, though this is made more difficult by timed platforming challenges. There's quite a bit of platforming too, though admittedly less than I assumed there would be when I started the research portion of this video. Of my nearly 9 hours, 51 minutes, 37 seconds, and 21 frames of gameplay, I spent 38 minutes, 25 seconds, and 51 frames of it platforming. So let's say roughly 15% of the gameplay was platforming. That's really not a small amount in reality, but my presumption was that it was going to be closer to 30 or 40%. Perhaps this is evidence that it was as bad as I'm claiming, as it felt significantly longer and more prevalent than it actually was, but regardless. Oh yeah, and there are entire side-scrolling levels that really blow. This is like a hilarious alternate reality version of KH1 where it was inspired more by Super Mario World than Super Mario 64, though in this alternate reality the team over at Square still has yet to figure out how to properly design a jump. It's incredibly stiff and feels awful, even worse than in the three-dimensional platforming challenges, even though the physics seem to be the same. At least you don't have to deal with the camera in this one, although most of the time it is auto-scrolling, so it's got that going against it too. Those are usually the least entertaining 2D Mario levels in my opinion. Anyway, I guess let's move on from that and talk about the next most common gameplay style, the turn-based combat. This is only in the Olympus Coliseum, though it has a surprising amount of depth for how long you end up doing it. There are 3 ways the battle can be started. Striking an enemy from behind gives a free turn to Sora and team at the beginning of the battle. Striking enemies from anywhere else starts the battle as normal, without any advantages or disadvantages. Getting struck by an enemy gives them a free turn at the beginning of the battle. This kind of stuff was already pretty standard fare by 2008, so no real prize for creativity, but it is implemented well enough. When in battle, you can perform melee combos, and the damage can be increased by performing well at a quick-time event. Think Paper Mario or a number of other turn-based battle systems. The timings on these are learnable and totally doable, but are also quite janky and don't feel great even after learning them well. Enemy attacks can also be blocked in the same manner, greatly reducing the damage you take. Timings, again, are a little janky, but learnable. Proper use of these QuickTime events is pretty necessary in order to succeed on the hardest difficulty in my experience. Commands can also be used, and translate into new attacks specific for this game mode. Combining more than one command will give either upgraded versions of attacks or more than one at a time in some cases. Commands recharge after successive turns and don't recharge in between battles. Items, called licenses, can increase your stats or perform other helpful actions like ensuring a safe escape from battle, instantly reloading all of your commands, or reviving party members. It's a surprisingly good system, though not without its faults. One problem I have with it is that the abilities that occur after queuing up commands are hidden until you've committed to the action, meaning you'll have to memorize or write down the combinations. This isn't a terrible thing, it's just odd mostly and makes using these commands just a touch less user-friendly. Then, of course, the timings for the QTEs are stilted and odd. Again, not a major flaw, just a little annoying as you're learning the system. Otherwise, it's a solid system and fills the time it's used well, giving the Coliseum a unique feel, but not overstaying its welcome. And if you really love it, there's quite a bit of extra content in the Coliseum that can be taken on at the player's discretion. Finally, we come to the on-rail shooting sections. There are 2 of these, both in bosses or otherwise pivotal moments. You can move left, right, and jump, as well as block enemy attacks. You shoot bullets with your Keyblade, which roughly auto-targets the enemies in front of you. Ability diamonds can be grabbed and give you an extra power. Some of them are useless and some of them are just barely not useless. Sometimes the game flips the screen or some sort of equivalent to screw with your controls. This adds some difficulty, but for the most part this game mode is absolutely forgettable. It also drags on for quite a bit too long in my book. The Wonderland section of this has numerous minutes-long phases that you have to go through before fighting the couple phases of boss against the Trickmaster. On the whole, these various gameplay styles are mostly fine, with the platforming and combat acting as outliers on either side of the middling at best turn-based combat and on-rail shooting. Like I said in the beginning, this game having so many gameplay styles is likely a result of it being on the mobile phone and therefore not being able to carry its own weight in one particular gameplay style. It ends up feeling a little disjointed now that the combat is not only good, it's probably the best combat system the mobile games have had, though that does remain to be seen, doesn't it? The story in this game is exactly the same as the original Coded, with the exception of the secret movies at the end and a couple of lines toward the end that were changed to fit some plot details established in Days and Birth by Sleep. I took notes while watching the HD version of the cutscenes that was released with the KH 2.5 Remix collection. This not only remasters the 3D cutscenes, but even creates new cutscenes based on the 2D text box cutscenes of the original, which is a great touch. It starts out with Jiminy trying to look into the strange message written in the journal. Think Namine, and another that has popped up. Their hurting will be mended when you return to end it. Chip and Dale turn the journal into a readable data format in order to try and recover its contents, but they find it full of bugs. They need someone inside the journal that can explore it and figure out what's going on with the bugs, and so Mickey finds Data Sora in the journal and sets him on the adventure. This is the basic excuse plot, which propels most of the gameplay, but it does get some decent intrigue later on. The journal chooses Riku's visage to be a messenger to the king and Donald and Goofy, and aims to help Sora by challenging his abilities to face the problems the journal has. Mickey, Donald, and Goofy end up being pulled into the datascape, along with Pete, who just happened to show up at the same time, and so they must help Sora in order to escape back to the real world. Maleficent joins Pete and decides that she wants to take over these worlds, because that is literally all she is capable of thinking about, and so they start causing problems throughout the worlds going forward. Maleficent shows up at the end of Agrabah and ends up destroying the data keyblade Sora has been wielding, forcing Sora into one of the more interesting combat variations the series has seen up to this point. Sora can't fight or use commands for the duration of this world, but Donald and Goofy eventually show up to help him fight. Now, your commands change to either Goofy attacks for physical commands or Donald attacks for magic commands. You also have 3 different instructions you can give them: move with Sora, attack Heartless, or destroy blocks. You can use the lock-on function to tell them which targets you want them to focus on also. This is a great way to connect the themes of power through friendship with the gameplay, even more so since this Sora isn't exactly the one Donald and Goofy know, and yet they are still able to work together so well. It's fun too. It reminds me a lot of a more basic version of V's gameplay from DMC5 actually. Eventually, Sora awakens to the Keyblade for real this time, and fights Pete. After beating him, Pete reveals he has essentially brainwashed Riku.
Please! Can't you hear what we're saying to you? Destroy me! What?
Riku falls unconscious and Sora must go into his heart, essentially, in order to cleanse him of the bugs Pete put inside of him. After doing so, Mickey, Donald, and Goofy are finally able to return home, but all is not well yet, as Sora's Heartless, the shadow he was turned into after freeing his heart to save Kairi, has grown in power as Sora has gone through his adventure, devouring the dark intentions of the Heartless Sora has slain. And so Sora must deal with his own shadow. After defeating it, Mickey tells Sora he's going to tell the real Sora about all of this. Maleficent thinks the journal has something to do with the ancient book of prophecies, which she says has the power to create new worlds, and so wants to take it over, of course. This is a new scene in the movie version of the game. Back in the real world, Mickey and crew realize they never actually figured out what those messages meant, and a new world has popped up. Sora has returned to the way he was prior to the game when the journal reset, and so they think he wouldn't be able to help, but Mickey decides to try anyway, appearing to Sora and saying he's going to tell Sora the truth, whatever that means. We go to the new world, which is Castle Oblivion, and find another black-cloaked man. What happens next is the decision-based exploration puzzles I referred to earlier. Each world we went through in the base game is repurposed here in an abstract sort of way. Each world will give you a set of choices to make, and the order or way you interact with the choices will determine the ending you get, of which there are 3. The game calls these endings normal, alternate, and extra, and the normal ending is required to move on to the next world. A very easy to point to example of how this works is the puzzle based on Traverse Town. In the actual story for this world, our goal was to save the 3 duck nephews, Huey, Dewey, and Louie. So in the Castle Oblivion version, the normal ending is achieved by saving them in the same order we did in the original version. The alternate ending is achieved by flipping Louie and Dewey's position in the order, and the extra ending is achieved by saving them in any other order. This also just happens to be the most annoying and uninteresting puzzle, since there is no real indication which orders will result in a unique ending other than the normal ending, which is somewhat obviously the original version of the events, as the game hints at this pretty heavily. 7 of the 9 potential orders result in the same frustratingly vague ending and no progression of any sort. The best puzzle in this series of puzzles is the one based on Wonderland. In it, you have 4 choices that determine the ending you get. First, you must tell Alice her name, or you can say she's the Queen of Hearts. Then, you must choose whether to grab the watch the rabbit drops, or just tell him where it is. If you grab it, the rabbit will be gone by the time you look back up. Then, the Cheshire Cat can be found and gives you a riddle. The riddle itself is interesting. The cat gives you 3 untruths that you have to reverse in order to figure out which block contains his finding. Your choice here is either to answer correctly or give up, as answering incorrectly will return you to the riddle after a brief fight with some shadows. Finally, a card soldier wants you to bring a potion to the Ace of Spades on the other side of the room. You can either give it to him, then giving the food he gives you to the Ace of Hearts, or give the potion to the Ace of Hearts in the first place. In order to get an ending, you have to choose one of these 2 options for each event. Let's say following the instructions to the letter and not taking the watch are the good choices, and not following the instructions to the letter and taking the watch are the bad choices. The normal ending is completing 3 or less of the tasks with the good choices. The bad ending is doing all of the bad choices, and the good ending is doing all of the good choices. In each ending, the Queen of Hearts will accuse you of stealing her memories, and she will tally up the evidence that she has against you, aka the bad choices you made. If you've made all good choices, she accuses you of covering your tracks and arrests you anyway. If you've made all bad choices, she lets you go because she figures you must have been trying but failing to be nice to everyone, and the punishment must match the crime. Figuring out how to get each of these endings was pretty entertaining all told, though it is somewhat dampened because of the way the menu is set up for the Cheshire's riddle. I Give Up is all of the way at the bottom, and it's kind of hard to even know it's there because of the way it scrolls. Other than that, this puzzle is fun to figure out, and the endings are humorous in a way these games typically aren't. The others aren't quite as interesting as Wonderland or as annoying as Traverse Town, though they do each have their issues. Destiny Islands is a little too simple, Olympus is a little too difficult because it's based on performance and a couple of combat challenges, and Agrabah is of course really lame. You just chase Iago around and try to catch him in a certain time frame, each ending having a different time frame. Hollow Bastion takes the cake for being bad though, because it's both based on performance and has the most difficult platforming gauntlet in the game. Overall, I really like what they did with Castle Oblivion in the game, but it's not entirely for the gameplay itself. Wonderland is quite interesting, but mostly what I like is what the story does during this part. The black-cloaked man, later revealed to be Roxas, spends much of the time in between puzzles questioning Sora's motive.
Friends. You don't say. So then what were their names again? Tell me.
Oh, I don't even have to think. What? Why can't I remember? I know them.
Like I said, everything in this castle is just an illusion. And once the illusions vanish, you'll forget all about your little reunion.
I'll forget?
Hey, no big deal. The fact that you can't remember them just means they weren't very important to you to begin with. Isn't that right?
That's not true! Of course my friends are always important to me. Okay, maybe I forgot what just happened and who I met inside that room. Trust me, I know I'll remember everything again.
Sure.
Sora expresses he's feeling something like hurt, almost like he misses these people even though he's never actually met any of them in his lifetime. Roxas tells him that he can let go of the hurt, stop caring about these people because he doesn't have a heart, and he can do so guilt-free.
Forget about the people you met in this place. You'll have no one to miss, no cause for loneliness, no hurt to keep eating away at your heart. Sora, it's your call. Cling to the memories you've lost, and the hurt they bring, till you're dragged into the darkness. Otherwise, let it all go, and then you can be free and happy. The decision is completely yours.
Wait!
When Sora thinks that the hurt he feels is the key he needs to unlock his memories, Roxas says, right on schedule. Roxas tells him later that he fell for it and that to find is to lose and to lose is to find. Perhaps the first time that strange sentence is actually used in a significant way.
So you heard. I warned you. Don't you remember what I said? That hurt will drag you down into the darkness. You have to get rid of all of it.
No, I don't. I can keep the hurt because it reminds me of something important. It lets me know that what I've forgotten is crucial. That's enough. I won't run from it. It'll stay inside of my heart until the day I remember.
The darkness will take you first.
If I put the hurt aside, I'll lose my ties to all the people I care about. My mind's made up. I may end up falling into the darkness, but I'll carry this with me. I'll only get rid of it when I remember everything, and not a day sooner than that. I'll keep the hurt with me for the time being. It's all that I have. It's what holds the pieces in place. I accept that.
You say you accept it? It's not a game! It's way past time that you learned what real hurt feels like!
This to me is the main draw of this game's story. Sora feels like he's lost these people. Even though he never actually knew them, his heart does. He grieves for them, essentially, but decides that the grief is what is going to keep all the pieces together, that he can hold onto it because it reminds him of something important. And he comes to this conclusion after struggling through Roxas's tests, a conclusion he came to on his own. It explores more how the heart functions, even for those made of data. Feeling like this hurt is good, that it reminds him of what's important in his life, is a pretty nuanced take on grief, especially for a series aimed at kids primarily, though that aim was shifting somewhat at this point. Roxas getting frustrated, feeling like Sora doesn't know what hurt really feels like, helps us to explore his character prior to the events of KH2, as this data version of him would have been the one present in between Chain of Memories and 2. Roxas's grief tears at him. He can't accept it because it's too painful. He wants to destroy it. We'll get to know more about his grief in the next video, but for now, I love this exploration of their characters. It's creative, interesting, and fairly complex. After the fight, Sora and Roxas share a conversation.
Come on, Sora. Do it! Finish me off! Why won't you do it? I get it. You've seen through my disguise. I'm just like everyone else you've encountered in this place, made of data. I'm not even worth the effort. Is that what it is? Guess there's no point in destroying something if it never existed. Is that right?
Not at all. You say that you're an illusion, but you certainly pack a really big punch. You said that you'd show me hurt, and you weren't wrong. Actually, the hurt that I just felt was more than that. Sure, it might have hurt while we were fighting, but I sensed a different kind of hurt from you. It was kind of like an intense, sharp pain. But it felt sort of familiar, almost like it was my own. As if we'd been connected, like right then we shared the same hurt. If somehow it brings me closer to people in that kind of way, then carrying around a little hurt can't be all that bad.
Can't be all that bad. All right, I give up. Here. You pass, Sora. Congratulations, you understand hurt. Now, use this to find the truth.
What do you mean?
My role was to see if you were ready to take ownership of the hurt inside you. And now that role is done. Nothing left for me to do but go away.
Are you gonna go back home?
I don't know if I really have one. But there's a place I'd like to be.
A place? Where? Oh! What's this feeling? I've got memories that don't belong to me. A place to call home. And a sunset that's comforting. My first and my last
summer vacation.
You can rest easy. I've got you now.
We go back to Naminé, and she tells us that she is not worthy of thanks because she's the cause of the bugs and why Sora's memories are gone in the first place. She presents the memories that she found in Sora. She wanted to make sure he could handle them.
I wish I could have told you this in person. But the real me is gone. She doesn't exist now.
Guys? You kinda lost me a few minutes ago.
Yeah, us too, bud. Naminé then shows us the memories in question. We see Roxas and Axel, and another girl with black hair. We then see 3 more people, one who looks oddly familiar. Sora is the key to saving all of these people.
Oh yeah. I almost forgot. I have a message for you too. Thank you.
That's the end of the story as it was encoded, prior to the releases of Days and Birth by Sleep. The following secret movies were added in Recoded, and then the movie version on the 2.5 remix. The first one shows Mickey talking with Yen Sid, and explains that when someone's heartless and nobody are both defeated, that someone is returned to life. I actually like this because it doesn't really feel like a retcon or anything like that. It makes sense given what we know about the heartless and nobodies, and seems like a pretty natural progression of their functionality. Being turned into a heartless is not technically death, just losing one's heart, and a nobody can't exist at the same time as the original body because they contradict each other. So, returning the heart and destroying the nobody, it stands to reason that this might just return the person's heart back to their true body. This means that Xehanort is going to come back. Yen Sid then implies that Xehanort might be trying to build a collection of clones of some sort in order to fight them, and so they should summon Sora and Riku in order to do what he calls the Mark of Mastery exam, pointing toward Dream Drop Distance. The second secret movie shows Break, the human version of Xigbar, standing over a pile of unconscious or dead bodies, those likely belonging to other human members of the organization based on the hair. This feels more like that one cutscene added in KH2 than anything else, the dialogue feeling somewhat ham-fisted in order to get the necessary details across. Another man stands across from him, and then says something kind of horrifying.
With the passing of time, as you can imagine, more and more Keyblades were forged to be handed down. But of all the Keyblades in existence, Master Xehanort's is the most ancient. That is my destiny. But it has yet to become a reality.
Great, so does that mean that we're talking about time travel here? Then this happens.
Whatever. I got my hands full with my own plans. So, which poor soul will it be?
I don't exactly know what it means, though it's possible we're not supposed to yet. A lot of people don't like this game. Most of those that don't like it say it's because of the story has no bearing on the plot going forward at all, beyond the secret movies which were retroactively added to fit better into the story going forward. I say, not every game needs to have pivotal plot significance. Remember in my previous videos that my argument against the Disney Worlds wasn't necessarily that the stories had no bearing on the overarching plot, just that they needed to have some interesting character interactions in order to feel important. In fact, every game needing pivotal plot significance is how we ended up in this mess in the first place. This mess, of course, referring to the state of the story in the modern day. I mean, there's a meme about how Nomura took so long to get Sora into Smash because he was trying to figure out how Sora fighting in Smash Bros. Would fit into the canon of the series, and to be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if Nomura actually came right out and said, Apparently, in an interview with Game Informer, he was quoted as having said, "Behind the scenes, I was actually the one being very picky about his appearance in Smash Bros. Disney was the one that was like, go ahead, this is a great opportunity. I thought it would be tough to pull off because it might clash with the established lore in Kingdom Hearts and the Disney worlds, so it was an opportunity I had to consider very carefully." So that's hilarious in a kind of sad way. This story is a little meandery and suffers from that all too video gamey stuff happens approach that just feels like a set of dominoes falling over with very little relevance to any one event, but it still manages to explore its characters during parts and does a good job at that. Most of the people that like this game say it's because it's got some of the best gameplay of the mobile games, if not the best gameplay of the series. I seriously struggle with that last one, though I think at this point I do indeed agree with that first point. The combat of this game is well-rounded and fun, not without its faults, but it uses the new command deck system in a satisfying and fluid way. It falls apart in certain areas, but it's a good outing for the series and is oddly overlooked, probably because it's been sentenced to death on the DS and doesn't have the same caliber of story as Days. Speaking of Days, it's about time I subjected myself to video game-induced depression again.